The day my father laughed in my face and called me uneducated and worthless, I already knew a secret that could destroy everything he believed about me. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I was 28 years old when my entire life split into a before and an after. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. Dad stood in the middle of his garage, wiping grease from his hands while I loaded old boxes into the back of my pickup. He had that familiar look. The one that said he had already judged me before I opened my mouth. "You still driving that old truck?" he asked. "It gets me where I need to go." He smirked. "I guess that's good enough for someone who never finished college." I didn't answer. He never missed a chance to remind me that I had dropped out after my sophomore year. To him, my younger brother Tyler was the success story. Tyler had a degree, a six-figure office job, and expensive clothes. I had dirty work boots. Dad looked toward the driveway where Tyler's new SUV had just pulled in. "See," he said. "That's what hard work looks like." I almost laughed. If only he knew. But he didn't. Not yet. Because buried beneath the passenger seat of my truck was a weathered envelope with my name written across it in handwriting I had never seen before. And somehow, it had been hidden inside my grandmother's attic for almost 20 years. Grandma Eleanor had passed away 3 days earlier. She had been the only person in the family who treated everyone the same. She never compared Tyler and me. Never asked why I left college. Never cared how much money I made. She simply hugged me every Sunday and said, "People become who they are in ways the world never sees." At the funeral, those words wouldn't leave my mind. Neither would the strange way her lawyer had looked at me afterward. "She wanted you to clean the attic yourself," he'd said quietly. "No one else?" "No one else." I hadn't thought much about it then. Until I found the box. It was tucked behind old Christmas decorations and wrapped in a faded blue blanket. There was no label. No lock. Just dust thick enough to hide years of silence. Inside were old family photographs, newspaper clippings, receipts from the early 1990s. And one sealed envelope. Across the front were only 4 words. "For Ethan. Alone." I almost opened it right there. Instead, I slipped it into my jacket. Something told me not to let anyone see it. Especially my father. Now, standing in Dad's garage while he criticized every choice I'd ever made, I could feel that envelope sitting inside my truck like it weighed 100 pounds. "You know," Dad continued, "your grandmother worried about you." I looked at him. "She told you that?" "She didn't have to." He shrugged. "She knew you wasted your potential." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because they were true. Because they weren't. Grandma had never spoken to me that way. Not once. For a second, I almost reached into my truck. Almost handed him the envelope. Almost asked if he recognized the handwriting. Instead, I kept quiet. Sometimes silence tells you more than arguments ever can. That evening I drove home to the small cabin I rented outside town. It wasn't fancy. 1 bedroom. Old wooden floors. A porch that creaked every time the wind picked up. But it was peaceful. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter. And beneath it, a black and white photograph. The picture stopped me cold. It showed a younger version of my father. He couldn't have been older than 25. Standing beside him was Grandma. On the other side was a man I'd never seen before. His arm rested comfortably around Dad's shoulder. They looked close. Like family. I turned the picture over. Written neatly on the back were the words. "The day we promised never to tell Ethan." My pulse quickened. "Never tell me what?" I unfolded the letter with shaking hands. It wasn't long. Just a single page. "Ethan. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There is something your father has hidden for most of your life. I begged him to tell you himself. He never did. I cannot carry this secret into my grave. But before you confront anyone, find the cedar box beneath the floorboards in the old lake house. Only then will you understand why your father made the choices he did. Love. Grandma. I read it again. Then again. The old lake house? We hadn't owned a lake house since I was a child. Dad sold it after Mom died. At least, that's what I'd always been told. The next morning I drove to the county records office. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. A woman behind the front desk smiled politely. Can I help you? I'm trying to find property records. She searched the address. After several minutes, she frowned. That's strange. What is? The property wasn't sold when you think it was. I leaned closer. What do you mean? It transferred ownership. To who? She hesitated. I'm sorry. You'll need the archived documents for that. They're not here? No. Where are they? In storage. How long will that take? Probably a few days. A few days. Every answer seemed determined to arrive one step too late. On my way home, I stopped at Miller's Hardware. The owner, Mr. Raymond Miller, had known my family for decades. When I mentioned the lake house, his expression changed. I haven't heard that place mentioned in years. You remember it? He nodded slowly. I remember your grandmother visiting there after everyone thought it had been abandoned. My stomach tightened. She kept going there? Every few months. Did she ever say why? He looked toward the front windows before answering. No. Then he lowered his voice. But she was never alone. I stared at him. Who was with her? I couldn't tell. You saw them? Only from a distance. Were they family? I honestly don't know. He paused. But whoever it was, your grandmother trusted them. That answer only made the mystery deeper. Who had Grandma been meeting in secret? And why had nobody ever mentioned it? That night I couldn't sleep. I spread everything across my kitchen table. The photograph. The letter. A county map. Old family pictures. One image caught my attention. It showed Tyler and me fishing with Dad when I was about 8 years old. In the background, barely visible, was the same unfamiliar man from the black and white photograph. Watching us. I had looked at that picture hundreds of times growing up. I'd never noticed him before. How many other things had I failed to see? The following afternoon I drove to where the old lake house used to stand. Or where I believed it used to stand. The gravel road was overgrown. Trees had swallowed most of the driveway. The cabin looked tired but untouched. Dad had said it was sold. He had lied. The front door was secured with a rusted chain. I walked around the side of the house until I reached a broken window. Inside, dust covered everything. But one thing looked different. Near the fireplace, a section of the wooden floor was cleaner than the rest. As if someone had lifted it recently. My heart pounded. I knelt down, slipped a pocketknife beneath the edge of the board, and slowly pried it upward. Underneath, there wasn't just a cedar box. There were two. One had Grandma's name carved into the lid. The other had mine. For a long moment, I simply stared. The dust around the floorboards looked untouched, but the cedar boxes didn't. Someone had been here. Maybe weeks ago. Maybe yesterday. I reached for the smaller box first, the one with my name carved into the lid, but stopped myself. Grandma's letter had never said which box to open. Only that I needed to find them. That suddenly felt important. I lifted Grandma's box first. It wasn't locked. The lid opened with a soft creak that echoed through the empty cabin. Inside was a stack of neatly folded letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, a silver house key wrapped in cloth, and a small cassette tape. No player. Just the tape. Written across its label in black ink were 5 words. Only if Ethan is ready. My throat tightened. Ready for what? I carefully untied the ribbon around the letters. The first one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to my father. Daniel. If you're reading this, then you've once again chosen silence over truth. You think you're protecting Ethan. But secrets don't disappear. They grow. I stopped reading. Grandma hadn't sounded angry. She sounded tired. Like someone who had spent years waiting for another person to do the right thing. I folded the letter back exactly as I'd found it. Those words weren't meant for me. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the second cedar box. The one with my name. Unlike Grandma's, it had a tiny brass lock. At first I thought I wouldn't be able to open it. Then I remembered the silver key. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked. I took a slow breath and lifted the lid. Inside was almost nothing. Just an old leather journal. And a folded birth certificate. My own. Confused, I unfolded it. Everything looked normal until I reached the bottom. The line for my mother's signature was exactly where it should be. But beneath it was another line. Witness. The signature wasn't familiar. Not a doctor. Not a nurse. The name read. Samuel Hayes. I whispered it aloud. Who are you? The name meant nothing. Yet Grandma had hidden it for decades. There had to be a reason. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around so fast that the journal slipped from my hands. Who's there? Silence. The afternoon wind pushed through the broken window. I listened. Another faint sound. Outside. I hurried to the front porch. The tree swayed gently. No one. Still. The fresh tire tracks leading away from the cabin hadn't been there when I arrived. Someone had been watching. I drove straight to the town library. Small towns never really forget people. Sometimes their records remembered more than the people themselves. Mrs. Donnelly, the elderly librarian, smiled as I walked in. Ethan Brooks. I need a favor. She laughed softly. You always did come straight to the point. I slid my birth certificate across the desk. I'm looking for someone named Samuel Hayes. Her smile faded. She adjusted her glasses and stared at the paper. I haven't heard that name in years. You know him? I knew of him. My pulse quickened. Who was he? She hesitated. He worked as an investigator. Police? No. For who? She lowered her voice. Insurance companies, attorneys, sometimes families. What kind of families? The ones hiding something. Before I could ask another question, she stood and disappeared into the archive room. When she returned, she carried a thin newspaper folder. There isn't much. Inside was a yellowed article. Local investigator retires after 30 years. A black and white photograph accompanied it. Older. Gray-haired. But unmistakable. Samuel Hayes. I looked closer. Standing several feet behind him. Almost out of frame. Was my grandmother. Why would she attend an investigator's retirement? Mrs. Donnelly noticed my expression. Your grandmother respected him. For what? I don't know. But people said he helped families uncover the truth. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that every answer came with another locked door. Grandma. Samuel Hayes. The lake house. The hidden boxes. None of it connected. At least. Not yet. When I pulled into my driveway, another surprise was waiting. Tyler's SUV. He leaned against the porch railing with his arms folded. "You've been ignoring Dad." "I've been busy." "Busy doing what?" I looked past him. "Why are you here?" He sighed. "He thinks you're upset about what happened. He called me worthless. You know how he is." "No." I met his eyes. "I know how he chooses to be." Tyler looked away. For the first time in years. He didn't defend Dad. Instead, he asked quietly, "Have you found something?" The question froze me. "What makes you ask that?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Because Grandma talked to me before she died." Every muscle in my body tightened. "What did she say?" "She asked me to stay out of your way." "That's it?" He nodded. "She said." He swallowed. "The truth belongs to Ethan now." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Tyler said something I never expected. "I don't think Dad is the man either of us believes he is." That evening, after Tyler left, I finally opened the leather journal. The first half was empty. Every page blank. I almost thought I'd found another dead end. Then I noticed something strange. Several pages had faint impressions, as if someone had written on sheets that were no longer there. I held the journal under my desk lamp. Indented words slowly appeared. Not clearly. Just enough. One sentence stood out. "Don't let Daniel sign the papers. My father." Another page revealed only 3 readable words. "Not his decision." I turned another page. Nothing. Then another. Finally. Near the center of the journal. A folded photograph slipped onto the floor. I picked it up. It was newer than the others. Color instead of black and white. The date in the corner read just 6 years earlier. Grandma stood beside an older Samuel Hayes. Between them was a young woman I had never seen before. She couldn't have been older than 30. She was smiling, holding a little girl by the hand. Across the back of the photograph, Grandma had written only one sentence. "Someday Ethan deserves to meet them." My hands began to shake. Meet who? Who was the woman? Who was the little girl? And why did Grandma believe I deserved to know them? Before I could think any further, my phone rang. The screen showed one word. Dad. I answered. Neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice I had never heard from him before, he quietly said, "Ethan, if you've been to the lake house, leave whatever you found there, and don't tell anyone." The line went dead. I stared at the phone. He hadn't asked. He hadn't denied anything. He already knew I'd found the boxes. The only question left was, how? Chapter 3. I didn't sleep that night. Dad's words kept replaying in my head. Leave whatever you found there, and don't tell anyone. He hadn't sounded angry. He'd sounded frightened. It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard fear in his voice. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't putting anything back. If Grandma had spent years hiding those boxes, she had trusted me for a reason. I owed her the truth. The next morning, I drove to the address listed in the old newspaper article about Samuel Hayes. His office was gone. The brick building now housed a bakery. An elderly woman arranging flowers outside noticed me staring at the faded sign still hanging above the doorway. "Looking for Mr. Hayes?" she asked. "I guess it's obvious." She smiled sadly. "You're about 10 years too late." "He passed away?" She nodded. "But his daughter still comes by every Thursday." "What time?" "Usually after lunch." I thanked her and waited. For nearly 2 hours. At exactly 1:30, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. A woman in her early 60s stepped out carrying a small cardboard box. She looked tired, but kind. "Mrs. Hayes?" I asked. She turned. "Yes? My name is Ethan Brooks." The moment she heard my last name, her expression changed. "You shouldn't have said that name out here." My heart skipped. "You know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are." She glanced up and down the street before unlocking the bakery's side entrance. "Come inside." The empty dining area smelled of fresh bread. She led me into a small office in the back. Without saying a word, she opened the cardboard box she'd been carrying. Inside were dozens of old files. Most were labeled with names I didn't recognize. Then she pulled out one thick folder. Across the tab, in faded handwriting, were 2 words. Brooks family. I stared at it. "You've had a file on my family all these years?" "My father did." "Why?" She took a deep breath. "Because your grandmother hired him." "To investigate who?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Your own family." The room suddenly felt too small. My grandmother thought someone was lying. About what? My father never told me. She slid the folder toward me. "But before he died, he gave me instructions." "What instructions?" "If a man named Ethan Brooks ever came looking." She stopped. "I was to give him only the first document." "Only the first?" "Not the whole file." I opened it carefully. Inside was a typed report. Most of the pages had been removed. Only the cover sheet remained. At the bottom, under the subject line, I saw 3 names. Daniel Brooks, Eleanor Brooks, and Margaret Brooks. I frowned. My mother's name was Sarah. Mrs. Hayes nodded slowly. "I know. So who is Margaret Brooks?" "I was hoping you could tell me." Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about that name. Margaret. No one in our family had ever mentioned a Margaret. When I reached my cabin, I spread old photo albums across the floor. Hours passed. Then, buried inside the oldest album, I found something strange. A photograph had been removed. Only the 4 black photo corners remained. Someone had deliberately taken it. As I lifted the empty page, a handwritten note fell out. Just 3 words. "Ask Aunt Helen." I hadn't spoken to Aunt Helen in almost 12 years. She lived nearly 3 hours away. Dad rarely mentioned her. Family gatherings stopped including her after Mom died. Whenever I asked why, Dad simply said, "Some people enjoy creating problems." Back then, I believed him. Now, I wasn't so sure. Aunt Helen answered the door herself. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were exactly the same. Sharp. Observant. Almost as if she'd been expecting me. "Ethan. You knew I'd come?" "No." She smiled sadly. "I just knew this day would eventually arrive." Those words sent a chill through me. Inside, her house felt frozen in time. Family photographs covered every wall. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Fishing trips. Then one picture caught my eye. It showed Dad in his 20s. Standing beside Grandma. Standing beside the same young woman whose name I'd just discovered. Margaret. I pointed. "Who is she?" Aunt Helen closed her eyes. "Oh, Daniel." She whispered the words to herself. Then she looked at me. "You really don't know?" "No." She sat down slowly. "For years I begged your father to tell you." "What is he hiding?" She reached for the photograph. Her fingers trembled. Margaret wasn't just part of the family. Then who was she? Tears filled her eyes. "She was your father's older sister." I felt the room spin. My father had a sister? Yes. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Because after she disappeared, Disappeared? Everyone agreed never to speak her name again. I couldn't breathe. She disappeared? Aunt Helen nodded. 30 years ago. What happened? No one knows. My stomach tightened. What do you mean no one knows? She left one morning. And she never came home. Everything I'd believed about my family suddenly felt incomplete. Dad had never once mentioned having a sister. Not once. Why erase someone completely? Unless there was more. Aunt Helen. She looked up. Was Margaret my aunt? Her eyes lingered on mine for a long moment. Then she answered carefully. By blood. Yes. By blood? Why phrase it that way? Before I could ask, she stood and walked into another room. When she returned, she carried a small tin box. This belonged to Margaret. She handed it to me. I've kept it hidden all these years. Inside were postcards. A necklace. A dried flower. And one sealed envelope. Across the front, in familiar handwriting, were the words. If Ethan ever learns my name, let him read this. I stared at the envelope. My name. Again. Written decades before I was old enough to read. How could she know me? I whispered. Aunt Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the window, where the evening sun was beginning to fade. Then she quietly said the words that changed everything. Because, Ethan, Margaret disappeared just 8 months before you were born. The envelope suddenly felt heavier than the cedar boxes, and for the first time, I realized the greatest secret in my family might not be about my father at all. It might be about me. Chapter 4. For nearly a minute, I couldn't bring myself to break the seal. The envelope rested in my hands while 100 impossible thoughts raced through my mind. Aunt Helen sat quietly across from me. She didn't rush me. She simply waited. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting was steady. Dear Ethan. If you're reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either your father finally chose the truth, or life forced it out of hiding. Knowing Daniel, I fear it was the second. I stopped. Aunt Helen lowered her eyes. I continued reading. You don't know me, but I already know your name because your grandmother told me what your parents planned to call you if they were ever blessed with a son. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So that was how she knew. Not because of some impossible mystery. Because Grandma had told her years before I was born. The letter continued. If I am gone, don't hate your father before you hear his side. He made terrible mistakes, but not all of them came from selfishness. Some came from fear. Fear can ruin good people just as easily as bad ones. I looked up. She was protecting him. Aunt Helen nodded. Margaret always did. I turned to the final paragraph. There is one person who knows what happened after I left. Her name is Claire. She promised never to speak unless Daniel allowed it. If he still refuses, show her this letter. She'll understand. At the bottom was an address. Only 40 miles away. The drive to Claire's house felt longer than any trip I'd ever taken. It was a modest white farmhouse surrounded by old oak trees. A woman in her late 60s answered the door. Her smile disappeared the moment she saw the letter in my hand. Where did you get that? It belonged to Margaret. Her eyes filled instantly. I haven't seen her handwriting in almost 30 years. My name is Ethan Brooks. She closed her eyes. So, it has finally begun. She invited me inside. Family photos lined her shelves, but none included Margaret. That seemed intentional. I promised Daniel I would stay silent, she said. But Margaret gave me permission to speak if you ever came. She unfolded the letter and read it silently. Then she looked at me. Your father has carried this alone for too long. What happened to Margaret? Claire took a long breath. She wasn't kidnapped. She didn't disappear? No. Then why did everyone believe she had? Because that's the story your father wanted the town to believe. Every answer uncovered another question. Why would he do that? Claire's voice trembled. Because Margaret begged him to. She walked to an old cabinet and removed a worn photo album. Inside were pictures of Margaret smiling beside a young man I'd never seen before. They were engaged. Why didn't they marry? They planned to. Claire turned another page. Margaret now appeared several months pregnant. My heart skipped. She was expecting a baby. Claire nodded. But the baby's father was diagnosed with an aggressive illness before the wedding. He died? 6 weeks later. Silence settled over the room. Margaret had lost the man she loved before their child was even born. She was heartbroken, Claire continued. She wanted to leave town. She didn't want pity. She didn't want people whispering about raising a baby alone. So she left. Yes. Then why fake a disappearance? Claire looked toward the window. Because Daniel believed the town would never leave her in peace. He thought pretending she'd vanished was kinder than exposing her private life. It sounds foolish now. She smiled sadly. But your father was only 24. He thought he was protecting his sister. I leaned back, trying to absorb everything. Dad hadn't erased Margaret out of hatred. He'd done it because she'd asked him to protect her future. It had become a secret that lasted decades. But where is she now? Claire's smile faded. I don't know. You lost contact? We exchanged letters for years. What happened? They suddenly stopped. When? She thought for a moment. About 6 years ago. 6 years. The exact same year as the photograph Grandma had left me. The one with Samuel Hayes. The unknown woman. And the little girl. I pulled it from my wallet. Claire stared at it. Oh. She touched the picture gently. So Eleanor found her. You recognize this woman? Of course. Who is she? Claire looked directly into my eyes. That's Margaret. I felt my heart pound against my ribs. The smiling woman I'd been trying to identify all this time. Was my father's missing sister. Then I pointed to the little girl. And her? Claire smiled through tears. That's Margaret's daughter. So my cousin. Yes. I stared at the child. She couldn't have been older than 5 in the picture. Does Dad know? Claire's silence answered before her words did. No. He never knew his sister was alive? He believed she'd died years earlier. What? Margaret wanted it that way. I couldn't understand. Why? Claire reached into the album again. This time she removed a folded postcard. It's easier if you read her own words. I unfolded it carefully. It was addressed to Claire. One sentence stood out immediately. Tell Daniel I'm gone. He'll stop searching and finally live his own life. I lowered the card slowly. For 30 years. My father hadn't abandoned his sister. He'd mourned her. He'd believed she'd died. No wonder he'd never spoken her name. Every mention must have reopened a wound. Suddenly, I saw him differently. Not as the cold man who constantly judged me. But as someone carrying grief he had never been allowed to share. Just then, my phone vibrated. It was Tyler. The moment I answered, he spoke so quickly I could barely follow. Ethan, where are you? Why? Dad collapsed. Ice ran through my body. What happened? He was cleaning out Grandma's bedroom. And? He found another letter. My grip tightened around the phone. What did it say? Tyler's voice cracked. It said. He struggled to finish. It said Margaret is still alive. The line went silent. I looked down at the photograph in my hand. For the first time in 30 years. The truth had reached my father. But I had a feeling it had arrived far too late.